My whole family cheered as Dad dropped the beach house keys into my sister's hand. She was already smirking before she touched them. Then the lawyer stood up and tore it all apart. She smirked before she even touched them. That's the detail I keep coming back to. Not the moment Dad pulled the keys from his pocket. Not the applause, or my mother's tears, or the way 40 people turned toward my sister like sunflowers following a light source. What I can't shake is that fraction of a second before the keys landed in Natalie's palm, when her lips curled and her eyes slid sideways to find me in the crowd, and she smiled like she had already won something she'd spent years engineering. She already knew. She had known for weeks, maybe longer, and she needed me to see it happen in real time. That was the point. I was standing near the back of the deck, slightly behind a cousin I barely recognized anymore, holding a glass of iced tea I hadn't sipped in an hour. The sun was just touching the water. The beach house glowed the way it always did at golden hour, weathered cedar shingles, white trim, the old anchor weather vane on the roof that my grandfather had installed in 1987 and refused to replace even when it started listing to one side. I had grown up inside those walls. My first memory in any house is of that kitchen. Yellow linoleum, the smell of Old Bay and coffee. My grandfather's radio always tuned to something nobody under 60 would recognize. And in about 30 seconds, my father was about to hand it to my sister like a prop in a ceremony she had scripted herself. The applause started before the keys even changed hands. That's what I remember. Like the crowd had been waiting for permission to celebrate something they already believed was settled. Then a chair scraped against the wooden deck. Loud, deliberate, not an accident. Every head turned. Robert Ames stood up from the back corner of the crowd. He was 71 years old. He had represented my grandfather's estate for over 2 decades. He dressed like he still appeared in federal court. Dark suit, silver tie, briefcase that looked older than most of the people at the party. He wasn't smiling. He looked like a man who had been holding something in his chest for a very long time and had finally been given permission to set it down. "Robert," my father said. His voice had that cautious quality, the one he used when he suspected he was about to be inconvenienced. "Everything all right?" Robert reached into his briefcase without answering. He removed an envelope, old paper. The edges had gone yellow. Written across the front in my grandfather's cramped, deliberate handwriting were 6 words: "To be opened after Natalie's graduation celebration." He broke the seal. The deck went completely silent. Even the water seemed to quiet. My grandfather's name was Harold Desmond Marsh. Everyone called him Hal. He was born in 1941 in Chesapeake City, Maryland, the second son of a waterman who worked the bay until his hands stopped cooperating. Hal spent 60 years building a small but real estate business. Nothing glamorous, mostly residential properties in a 3-county radius, and along the way he acquired the beach house on Fenwick Island in 1983. He paid $74,000 for it. By the time he died in October of 2019, it was appraised at just under $1.1 million. He died of a stroke. He was 78. He had been sharp until the very end, reading the Wall Street Journal every morning, arguing with the television, making phone calls that his children didn't always know about. He was the kind of man who prepared for things quietly and alone and didn't announce his preparations until they were complete. I am Elena Marsh. I was 32 when the keys ceremony happened, and I had spent most of those 32 years being the quieter daughter in a family that did not especially reward quiet. My sister Natalie is 4 years older than me. She is the kind of person who enters a room and immediately reorganizes the energy inside it. Growing up, that quality made her magnetic. By adulthood, it had curdled into something more calculated. But my parents never quite saw the difference. To them, Natalie's noise was personality. My steadiness was absence. I won't pretend it never hurt. It did. What I stopped doing, somewhere around 26, was expecting it to change. Some dynamics are structural. You can either spend your life raging against the architecture, or you can build something somewhere else. I chose the second option. I got my real estate license at 23. I built a book of clients from nothing. By 28, I had transitioned into commercial properties, leasing light industrial space in the suburbs of Wilmington, Delaware, and by 30, I was managing a portfolio that generated enough that I bought my own condo in Trolley Square without asking anyone for a dollar or a favor. I didn't announce this to my family, I just did it. Natalie, in the same period, had a more complicated trajectory, a marketing degree that she used for about 2 years, a wedding that cost my parents $34,000 and lasted 18 months, a divorce that cost my parents an additional 12, a series of positions at companies she described variously as not the right fit, toxic environment, or I was overqualified. At 36, she was back living 40 minutes from our parents' house in Lewis, Delaware, working part-time as a brand consultant for a friend's small business, and spending what appeared to be significant energy managing her relationship with our father. The beach house was the center of gravity. It always had been. Grandpa Hal had taken each of us there every summer without exception. Days on the water, evenings on the deck. He cooked soft shell crabs and bluefish. He told stories about the bay that I have never heard from anyone else. I spent those summers following him around like a satellite, asking questions, listening. I was probably 11 or 12 the first summer I noticed he was watching me back. Not in a monitoring way, in a measuring way. Like he was performing a private calibration that he had never announced and intended to complete on his own schedule. Natalie had no interest in those conversations. She was friendly with Grandpa in the way she was friendly with most people, warmly and briefly, and always with one eye on something more interesting. She would spend spend an hour at the dock and then disappear inside to call friends. Grandpa never said a word about it. He just kept watching her go and then turned back to whatever we'd been talking about. The summer I was 16, Grandpa and I sat on the deck until almost midnight. The rest of the family had gone to sleep. We talked about property, about the house, about land, about what things were worth and why people miscalculated it. He said something that stayed with me for 16 years. People look at what a thing is selling for. Smart people ask why it was built in the first place. I thought he was talking about real estate. He was talking about me. I understand that now. The trouble with Natalie started 2 years before Grandpa Hal passed. It started subtly, the way her maneuvers always did. She began driving to Lewis on weekends to spend time with him. This itself wasn't suspicious. He was getting older. He needed more help around the property, and family showing up made sense. But I noticed, when I visited, that certain conversations had shifted. Grandpa would mention the house in a different tone. Natalie thinks we should put in central air. Natalie had some ideas about the dock. The pronoun was inclusive, but the ownership was implied. I mentioned it to my mother once. She said I was being competitive. I dropped it. The summer before he died, Natalie visited 9 weekends in a row. I know because my aunt mentioned it in passing, not as a criticism, just as a fact. She brought wine. She helped him clear the gutters. She organized his office. And on at least 3 of those weekends, Robert Ames was there. I know this because I asked Robert directly after the ceremony. He told me everything. Natalie had pushed for formal meetings about estate planning, about the house, about Grandpa's intentions. She framed them as concerned granddaughter conversations. Robert said Hal sat through them politely and said almost nothing. Natalie interpreted the silence as agreement. That was always her mistake with him. She thought quiet meant malleable. With Hal Marsh, quiet meant decided. 3 months after those visits, Grandpa called Robert and gave him a sealed envelope. He told Robert to hold it and open it publicly at the family gathering that followed Natalie's graduation from her master's program. She had enrolled in a 2-year program at Drexel, sustainable business or something adjacent to it, and the graduation date was set for May 2022. Grandpa died in October 2019, nearly 3 years before he would get to see it. He had planned for the gap. That was the kind of man he was. In those 3 years, without the document open, the assumption calcified. My parents started speaking about the beach house as if Natalie's custody of it was already established. The renovation conversation started. Natalie forwarded me Howe's articles about deck materials as if she were keeping me politely informed about a decision that was hers to make. My father referred to it twice at family dinners as Natalie's place. Nobody corrected him, including me. I told myself I had accepted it. I think what I had actually done was decided it wasn't worth fighting, which is a different thing. That distinction matters. Because when you accept something, you've processed it. When you decide not to fight it, it just sits in you, accumulating. By the time of the graduation party, I had 6 years of accumulation I didn't know how to name. The week before the party, Natalie called me. She was in a good mood, expansive, almost generous. She said she wanted to talk about the renovation timeline. For the beach house, I said. Once Dad makes it official. She said it the way you say something you've already rehearsed. I'm thinking open concept on the main floor. That kitchen is so closed off, and the deck needs to be doubled. The current one can barely fit 12 people. Grandpa built that deck himself, I said. Brief pause. I know. It's beautiful, but it's also 30 years old. Her voice smoothed over it. I just want to make sure it's usable for the whole family. The whole family. That was a phrase she deployed when she wanted something to sound inclusive that was in fact exclusive. I had heard her use it in her divorce proceedings, according to my aunt. I just want what's best for the whole family. Meanwhile, she had retained a paralegal who specialized in asset extraction. I said, okay, Natalie, I'll see you at the party. I hung up and sat at my kitchen table in Trolley Square for a long time. 3 days before the party, I reached out to Robert Ames for the first time in years. Not because I suspected anything. I want to be honest about that. I didn't have information. I was operating on intuition, and intuition alone. The same low-grade hum that had been telling me since I was 16 that something about those long dock conversations with Grandpa mattered, that he had not been just talking. I sent Robert an email that said, I know this may be unusual, but I wonder if there's anything I should know before the family gathering on Saturday. He responded in 3 sentences. He said he would see me there. He said everything would be handled professionally. And he said, your grandfather was a precise man. Precision, age as well. I didn't know what that meant. I reread it 4 times. Then I dressed for the party. The crowd that night was about 45 people. Aunts and uncles from both sides of the family. 3 sets of cousins, some of whom I barely recognized. Old friends of my grandparents, now white-haired and moving carefully. My parents' contemporaries, the couple friends they had held onto since the 1980s. All of them gathered on the Fenwick Island deck, under strings of bulb lights that had been strung that afternoon, with the Atlantic maybe 30 yards across the sand. Natalie circulated the party like she was the host. She had a white sundress, champagne. She touched shoulders and laughed at things early and occupied the center of every cluster she entered. I watched her from across the deck and thought, for probably the 100th time in my life, that she was extraordinary at the surface of things. The problem was, there was no depth behind the surface. There hadn't been in years. Whatever was driving her was need, not warmth, but she wore warmth so fluently that most people couldn't feel the difference. I stuck close to my Aunt Patricia, my mother's older sister, one of the few members of my extended family who had ever looked at me like I existed, and drank my iced tea and waited. My father tapped his glass at sunset. The crowd gathered and quieted. He talked about the beach house, about Grandpa, about how Hal had always wanted it to stay in the family, about Natalie's achievement, the master's degree, the hard work, the dedication. My mother was crying before he finished the second sentence. Natalie stood at the front with her hands clasped and her head slightly tilted, and the exact expression of someone who has practiced receiving. Dad reached into his jacket pocket and produced the keys. Old metal. The keychain was a small brass anchor, dull with years of handling. I had touched that keychain hundreds of times as a child. I knew the weight of it. He placed it in Natalie's hand. She lifted it, just slightly. Not high enough to be performative to the crowd, just high enough that I could see it from where I stood at the back. The smirk arrived before the keys even settled in her palm. A small, private, complete expression. Something she had been rehearsing, maybe not consciously, for a very long time. The applause was immediate. Phones came out. My cousin to my left started recording. I didn't move. And then the chair scraped. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. Robert stood, and the crowd shifted, and the energy on that deck changed in the space of 4 seconds from celebration to uncertainty to something approaching held breath. He unfolded the pages from the yellowed envelope. His voice was measured, professional, entirely without drama. He didn't need to add any. The document supplied it. For years, he read, many of you have assumed this property would pass to Natalie, based on conversations and expectations that were allowed to develop. I am clarifying those expectations now, because I owe this family clarity. Natalie's smile was gone. She was very still. The beach house at 14 Pelican Way, Fenwick Island, Delaware, was placed into a protected family trust in February 2018. That trust was designed to activate upon Natalie's graduation from a postgraduate program, a condition that has now been met. At that point of activation, full ownership authority, maintenance decisions, access rights, capital improvement authority, and ultimate disposition rights. Transfers to the trustee I personally selected. My father said, "Robert, who's the trustee?" Robert lowered the pages and looked directly at me. The silence on that deck was the loudest thing I have ever heard. My Aunt Patricia put her hand on my arm. I didn't move. I couldn't process what had just shifted in the room. I looked at Robert and he held my gaze and gave one single nod, and something in my chest, something that had been compressed for a very long time, expanded. Natalie's voice came out sharp and thin. "Fine. Who's the trustee?" She hadn't heard, or she had heard and couldn't accept it. "Elena Marsh," Robert said, "per the trust document executed February 14th, 2018. The air left the party. "This is a joke," Natalie said. The contempt was immediate, reflexive, and paper-thin over pure panic. "Someone forged this. Grandpa and I talked about this house. He told me specifically. He told you he wanted the house to stay in the family," Robert said calmly. "That is what Elena will ensure. That's not what he meant. He signed these documents himself. A notary and 2 witnesses were present. They were filed with the Sussex County Register of Deeds and sealed with my office pending this occasion." Robert walked toward me and placed a thick packet in my hands. Property deed, trust documentation, authorization forms, my name on every page, in type and in Grandpa Hal's signature as the grantor. "Legal authority transferred this afternoon at 3 p.m., Robert said. "The documents have already been recorded." Dad stepped forward. His face had gone the particular shade of red that meant he was cycling between anger and shame. "Robert, there has to be a mistake. Hal never said anything to us about—" "He said quite a bit," Robert said. "Just not to you." The murmur through the crowd was immediate and uncontainable. Natalie spun toward me. Whatever calculation or strategy she possessed had been completely overridden by something rawer. "Did you know?" she said. "Elena, did you know about this?" I looked at her. No, and that was true. I had suspected something. I had felt something, but I had not known. "You had to have. You were always, you and Grandpa, always your little—" She stopped herself, looked around, realized she was losing the crowd, the way she could always feel when the room was shifting. She tried a different approach. Her voice dropped, softened. "Dad, this isn't what Grandpa wanted. Elena doesn't even use this house. She barely came here. I've been here every summer. I've been maintaining it. I've been the one who—" "Natalie." My father's voice was strange. He wasn't angry at her. He was disoriented. I think he was realizing, for the first time, that his father had made a significant decision about a significant asset and had deliberately excluded my father from the conversation. That was a different kind of sting. Robert read one more passage from the document. "Elena has demonstrated over many years a quality I value above achievement: consistency. She managed responsibility whenever it appeared. She did not ask for recognition. She simply handled what needed handling. I trust her to do the same with this property, to hold it for the family, not to hold it against them." I thought about those summer evenings, the deck conversations that had run past midnight, the way Grandpa would ask my opinion on things that seemed too specific to be random, the cost of cedar siding, the zoning rules on Fenwick Island, what a property manager charged versus what they delivered. I had thought we were just talking. I understand now that he was interviewing me. For years, across dozens of conversations, building a file that only he had access to. He had been deciding, quietly, precisely, in the way of a man who had spent 60 years building things that lasted. Natalie was gripping the keys. Still, her knuckles had gone white. She stared at them like she was trying to figure out what they were worth now that the context had changed. Then she looked at me. Something behind her eyes cracked open. It wasn't grief. It wasn't even anger exactly. It was the specific devastation of someone who has spent spent years maneuvering towards something and discovered at the moment of arrival that the destination was never real. I turned toward the crowd. "Nobody is being removed," I said. My voice was steadier than I expected. "The house stays in the family. All of you. That's what Grandpa wanted. That's what I intend to honor." Applause, tentative, from a few corners. My Aunt Patricia, two of the older couples. But I had caught something in Robert's expression as I spoke. A small hesitation. The slight adjustment of a man who has just remembered there is one more page. "Robert," I said quietly, "is there something else?" He looked at me for a moment. Then he opened the second half of the document. There were conditions. Grandpa Hal had not simply handed me the house. He had structured the trust with a set of provisions that reflected very precisely the thing he was most afraid of, that the house would become a weapon, an instrument of one grandchild's control over another, or a vehicle for someone to cash out what he had built. The provisions were as follows. The property could not be sold for a minimum of 20 years without unanimous agreement from all living direct descendants of Harold Desmond Marsh. The trustee, me, had maintenance and access authority, but could not restrict family access without documented cause. Any capital improvements above $10,000 required written consent from both my parents and a second family member. The house could be rented to generate maintenance income, but rental revenue had to be held in a trust account and used only for property costs. In other words, I was the steward, not the owner. I could not profit from it. I could not sell it out from under anyone. I could not close the door on Natalie even if I wanted to. Grandpa had known exactly what he was doing. He hadn't given me the house because he loved me more. He had given me the stewardship because he trusted that I wouldn't treat it as a prize. He had looked at both of his granddaughters for 60 collective summers, and he had concluded, one of them will hold this open, the other will close it. He wasn't wrong. What followed the reading of that second document was a different kind of silence, more complicated. Natalie had been processing the trust as a defeat, as something taken from her. The provisions changed the shape of what I had been given. I hadn't received a trophy. I had received a responsibility with constraints attached. That nuance took a few minutes to settle across the crowd. My father sat down. He was very quiet. Later, I would learn he'd called Robert the following Monday, looking for a legal challenge, and Robert had calmly explained that the trust had been prepared precisely to withstand family pressure, that it had been reviewed by 2 independent estate attorneys before filing, and that any challenge would cost significant money and have negligible chance of success. My father called me that Thursday and did not apologize exactly. He said, "Your grandfather trusted you." He said it like it surprised him, like it was new information about me. I wanted to be angry about that. I mostly wasn't. I understood that my father had spent so many years looking at Natalie, that he had developed a kind of perceptual blind spot. I was always there. I just wasn't where he was looking. Natalie didn't speak to me at the party after the documents were read. She left within the hour. I heard from Patricia that she sat in her car for a long time before driving away. I don't know what she was feeling. I have thought about it a lot in the months since. I think she was grieving something that had never quite been real, a story she had told herself about her relationship with Grandpa, about the house, about being chosen. When you build your identity on being the chosen one, finding out the choice went differently is not just a loss of an object, it's a structural collapse. I'm not saying that to be cruel. I'm saying it because it's true, and because I spent years standing beside her and watching her build herself on that foundation, and I saw from the outside what she could never see from the inside. The weeks following the party were not quiet. Natalie called my parents daily. She hired a lawyer, not Robert, obviously, but someone out of Wilmington who reviewed the trust for a flat fee of $800 and sent back a letter confirming that it was, in his words, thoroughly bulletproof. She posted on social media about the importance of protecting family legacies from manipulation, which was vague enough that most people reading it wouldn't know what she meant, but specific enough that I knew exactly. 3 cousins texted me asking what happened. I told them the facts plainly once and did not revisit the conversation. My mother was the most difficult. She took Natalie's side not out of malice, but out of reflex. Natalie needed something, and my mother's orientation toward Natalie's needs was so deeply grooved that even a notarized trust document couldn't immediately reroute it. She called me twice in the first week to say she thought Grandpa had been confused at the end, that he might not have understood what he was signing. I told her as calmly as I could that he had signed in February 2018, 18 months before his stroke, with full mental capacity, before 2 witnesses and a notary. She went quiet. She didn't concede. She just went quiet. She came around slowly. By July, about 6 weeks after the party, she started calling me about the house directly. Practical things, the boiler needed service, the neighbor's tree was overhanging the property. What did I think about renting it out for August? The calls were stiff at first. Then they weren't. Patricia remained my steadiest ally throughout all of it. She was the one who told me in early July that Natalie had called her demanding she sign a letter to submit to the county challenging the trust. Patricia had refused. She'd told Natalie, Hal chose Elena because Elena is the one who would hold it open for all of us. He wasn't wrong. I cried when Patricia told me that. I don't cry easily. But something about hearing him described accurately by someone else after years of his decisions being reframed by the people around him, that broke something loose. The legal situation required my attention in ways I hadn't anticipated. The trust named me as trustee, but left several procedural details to be established: how the maintenance account would be managed, what the rental protocol would be, how family access would be documented. I spent several Saturdays at Robert's office working through it. He had a dry wit that I hadn't noticed when I was younger. He said, "Hal told me you were the one who actually understood real estate." I gather he wasn't exaggerating. "I didn't know he thought about it that way," I said. Robert raised an eyebrow. "He thought about everything that way." I set up a family maintenance account at a credit union in Lewis. I drafted an access calendar that gave any direct family member the right to book the house up to 4 weeks per year with 30 days notice, with some exceptions for peak summer weeks that would rotate annually. I sent the calendar to everyone. Natalie did not respond. My parents did. 3 cousins signed up immediately. In August, my parents stayed there for 10 days. I got a text from my mother on the 3rd day. "The Anchor weather vane is listing again. Do you want us to fix it or leave it?" I texted back, "Leave it. Grandpa liked it that way." She sent a single heart emoji. It was the most communication we'd exchanged about him since the funeral. The beach house at 14 Pelican Way is currently generating roughly $24,000 per year in rental income during the 4 months I allow commercial rentals. All of it goes into the maintenance trust account. The boiler was replaced in October. The dock needed decking boards. The kitchen, Natalie's kitchen, the one she wanted to gut and open up, still has its original layout and its yellow linoleum and its battered wooden hutch where Grandpa kept the tide charts and the fishing licenses and the handwritten notes from phone calls he never threw away. I go there alone sometimes, usually in September, after the renters have cleared out and before the cold really sets in. I sit on the old deck, still 12 feet by 14, still its original cedar, still exactly the right size, and I listen to the water. I think about my grandfather a lot in those moments, about what it means that he watched me for 20 years and made a decision about my character without telling me he was watching. Part of me wishes he had said something, named it, given me the knowledge while he was alive so I could have told him what those summers meant to me. The long nights talking, the specific education of being taken seriously by someone who took very little at face value. I understand why he didn't say anything. The trust only worked if it was a surprise. If he had told me, Natalie would have known. The maneuvering would have started years earlier. The document would have been challenged while he was still alive, in a condition where he could have been pressured. He protected the outcome by protecting the secret. It was the most him thing he could have done. Natalie and I have not spoken since the party. I have not closed that door. I have left it exactly as far open as she left it when she walked out to her car that night on Fenwick Island. She knows where the house is. She knows the calendar. She knows the access policy. When she's ready to come back, the anchor is still on the roof. The tide charts are still in the hutch. I think about what she must feel sometimes. The version of herself she constructed around being chosen. I know what it costs when that version collapses. It costs more than the object you were promised. It costs the story you built yourself from. That's not a small loss. I'm not in the position to mourn it for her, but I can acknowledge it. Some things that were real got broken in all of this. Not just what Natalie imagined she had. Something between us that might have been a real relationship if other choices had been made by both of us a long time ago. Grandpa used to say that property reveals people. He meant it as a warning about sellers, that the way someone handles a negotiation tells you who they actually are. But he could have been talking about family, about what happens when something real is on the table, and everyone decides in that moment who they're going to be. I found out who I was in that moment. Or rather, I found out that my grandfather had known who I was before I did. He spent 20 years watching me handle small responsibilities quietly and without complaint, watching me stay in the conversations after everyone else had gone inside, watching me show up consistently, without expectation of recognition. He built a trust around that, literally. That's the thing I keep returning to, sitting on the old cedar deck while the weather vane lists slightly to the west. The thing I did not do was ask for it. I never asked for his time, or his attention, or his assessment. I just kept showing up because I wanted to be there, because the conversations were real, because the water was beautiful, and the tide charts were interesting, and he was the smartest person in my family, and being around him made me feel less alone in a family where I often felt very alone. He noticed. He didn't say anything. He just quietly made a decision. That's what I'll carry from all of this. Not the property, not the legal authority, not the satisfaction of that moment when the crowd turned and Robert Ames looked at me. The thing I'll carry is the knowledge that being seen doesn't require being loud. That consistency, even when it goes unwitnessed, leaves a record. She smirked before she touched the keys. She needed me to see her win. Grandpa just needed me to show up. That's all it ever took.